about who might best kick off our 2026 annual theme tonight of life and liberty, the ideals of independence, and somehow also speak to this very moment in time we find ourselves in our country. One person rose to the top. I'm very glad he said yes when I went up to, when he spoke in Skowhegan and got a book and talked to him about this. His talk tonight will help us understand how we came to have such diverse regions in our country, how those regional differences have led us to where we are today, and how we might seek to return to a unifying concept as Americans. Colin Woodard is a New York Times bestselling author and historian and director of the Nationhood Lab at Salve Regina University's Pell Center for International Relations and Public Policy, where he studies the problems of the United States nationhood and how to solve them. A veteran foreign correspondent who has reported from more than 50 countries and 7 continents, Colin covered the fall and rise of authoritarian regimes across Eastern Europe and the Balkans and the aftermath of the Bosnian genocide. He received a 2012 George Koch Award and was a finalist for a 2016 Pulitzer Prize for his investigative work at Maine's Portland Press Herald. He's the author of 7 books, including American Nations, The History of the 11 Rival Regional Cultures of North America, Union, The Struggle to Forge the Story of the United States Nationhood, and Nations Apart, How Clashing Regional Cultures Shattered America, which, of course, we have here tonight, and we will be glad to sell you copies after the talk, and we will sign books after the talk. Colin's books have been translated into 13 foreign languages and inspired a primetime NBC television series and a blockbuster Ubisoft video game. He's kind of all over the place. He's a graduate of Tufts University and the University of Chicago, a past Pew Fellow in International Journalism at the Johns Hopkins University School for Advanced International Studies, and a current Fellow of the Royal Geographical Society in London. He is from and lives in Maine. Please join me in welcoming Colin Woodard.
Thanks so much to PHC for having me. It's an honor to be speaking as a historian and someone passionate about Maine history here in an institution like this. And Marissa and the rest of you, wow, 1.1 million, that is very impressive and speaks to the community, and that you all get the importance of understanding what is the community, where did it come from, and where are we going. So well done, and I'm thrilled to be here. So tonight, I'm going to be presenting on the issues in my new book, Nations Apart. This is a book about how we got here as a country, to the unfolding collapse of the Republic and a consolidation of a personalist authoritarian regime, and what we can do about it. Both in the near term, to defend our democratic system, but also in the longer term, to allow this country to achieve its extraordinary ideals. Now, I've actually been speaking on these issues for several years now because 3 years ago, I founded this project at the Pell Center at Salve Regina University that's allowed me to focus on these issues full time. Looks like the way to advance it. At Nationhood Lab, we say we study the problems of U.S. nationhood and try to solve them. Apparently, we're not doing a great job at that, but we will redouble our efforts. We do this in several ways. We do it through data journalism. So that's original analysis presented on our website and associated articles and coverage in mainstream media outlets, but also via peer-reviewed academic journal articles. I've authored or co-authored 36 such papers in as many months across a variety of disciplines, and in initiatives to develop tools and ideas to help defend the American experiment. So Nations Apart is partly an outgrowth of that work, but it goes beyond it, providing the background for the crisis that we're now in, and the cultural and historical intel we need in order to get back out again. I hope you enjoy it, and what better way if you decide to purchase the book than from PHC itself, so that the profits go right back into this institution. The Kyrgyz reviewer called it a lucid exercise in political geography with tremendous and disturbing explanatory power. The perfect gift. The loved one in your life needing expletive disturbance for their birthday, anniversary, Father's or Mother's Day. Anyway, from here forward, I want to share 3 things with you tonight in sort of 3 acts. First, how we got here, an explanation for why the United States, despite its myriad advantages, has always been divided against itself and thus vulnerable to collapse. And then secondly, to show how these divides have contributed to the squandering of our potential, the shattering of the social contract, and the rise of charlatans and demagogues. And thirdly, and finally, to explain the vital importance of having a story of common purpose, a story that can help hold us together against the forces of autocracy that threaten to bring down the Republic and shatter the Union, and to share some of the results of our work at Nationhood Lab to develop, test, and share just such a story for 21st century Americans. So I want to start with what I hope will be some helpful, deep background information on the fundamental characteristics of the U.S. Federation, characteristics that have made our country more structurally vulnerable than many of its liberal democratic peers. Here's an essential and often overlooked fact of our national experience. The United States is not a nation state at all, and it never has been. Rather, we're a collection of stateless nations. All these stateless nations each have their own intents, ideals, and stories of national purpose. These regional cultures, which don't respect state or often even international boundaries, have never been in agreement over the really big questions, like what's the proper role of government? What's the proper balance and relationship between church and state? Or even the meaning of such key words in the American lexicon as freedom or liberty. These stateless nations, these regional cultures, go back to the beginning of European conquest and settlement, to the 17th and early 18th centuries. The original clusters of colonies were settled by people from distinct parts of the British Isles, and from France, and the Netherlands, and Spain, each with their own religious, political, and ethnographic characteristics. Each was first colonized at a separate time and under a different political model. Now, some of these championed individualism, others, utopian social reform. Some embraced an explicit Anglo-Protestant identity, others, ethnic and religious pluralism. Some valued equality and democratic participation, others, deference to an aristocratic order modeled on the slave states of classical antiquity. The Puritan project up here in New England had very little in common with the neo-feudal aristocratic society of the Chesapeake country, or with the Dutch commercial colony encompassing what's now greater New York City, or New Spain's far-flung northern frontier, or the West Indies Slave Society, planted in the deep southern lowlands by planters from the island of Barbados who had run out of room in the 1670s on their island. For generations, these discrete Euro-American cultures developed in remarkable isolation from one another, consolidating their own cherished principles and fundamental values, and expanding across the eastern 2/3 of the continent, roughly, in nearly exclusive settlement bands. Now, they saw one another as competitors for land, for settlers, for capital, and occasionally as enemies, taking opposing sides in the English Civil War of the 1640s, in the Glorious Revolution of 1688, or by the time we heard about it over here, 1689, in the American Revolution, and the War of 1812, and most obviously, the U.S. Civil War. Here, incidentally, is a map of the Spanish colonization of what's now the southwestern United States. The areas that are shaded are the areas that were actually, like, not just claimed on paper, but colonized boots on the ground prior to the U.S. annexations in the first half of the 19th century. The point is that there's never been an America, but rather several Americas. And today, there are 11 major ones and 4 enclaves encompassing the territory of what's the United States. The enclaves are smaller areas that they're extensions of regional cultures that have their core and their sort of nexus located outside the United States in what's today Canada or Oceania or the Caribbean. But the key thing is that they've always been divided on key issues, and that's had profound effects on politics and society. And just to get, this map that you're seeing here and all future ones, this is just a map of essentially those arrows settlement patterns, those rival settlement patterns you saw before, right? The doctrine of first effective settlement, the cultural geographer Woodward devised in the 1970s, argued compellingly that the first group of settlers who show up in a place and drive out the population is there or where there's no people at all, their characteristics of that group will have an outsized influence on the future trajectory of that society, even if the numbers are really small, numbers of people who came later are quite large. They sort of format the hard drive culturally, if you will, the ideas and stories of who we are. And this is a map of that. So, just to demonstrate, let me just quickly go through Yankee so you kind of follow it. So in the Yankee example, right, the founding settlement group was really the Winthrop fleet, the Puritans in the 1630s, coming to Massachusetts Bay, setting up their utopian society. People who believed that they were an Old Testament style covenant with God, like the biblical Hebrews, and that God had charged them to do certain things in the New England wilderness as a group. And they would be punished or rewarded as a group for how it went. So, if your neighbor's messing up, it's going to affect the whole group. Individual liberty is not as important as the success of the mission in the group, and they would do it through public institutions, taxpayer-financed public schools, because for theological reasons, they believed that each person had to read the Bible themselves, and that meant everyone needed to know how to read. So quickly, by the 1650s or 1660s, because of this compulsory taxpayer-financed public school system in the 17th century, New England probably had the highest literacy rates of any society on the planet, with knock-on effects downstream, because once you have a literate society, you can have a market for printing presses and newspapers and the creation of libraries and people to school, and they create colleges and institutions, which is why all of those things were overwhelmingly concentrated in the Yankee zone all the way through to the 20th century, and still are overwhelmingly concentrated there. Anyways, the Puritans came in the 1630s with some of those fundamental characteristics, and then they quickly moved to annex the old colony of the Pilgrims on Cape Cod and the weird royalist settlements up here in Maine that Sir Ferdinand Gorges had set up. And then they pulled New Hampshire and Connecticut into the orbit into a federation of New England. And then, when the Dutch, who had set up New Netherland, right, were defeated in that colonial war in the 1670s, suddenly New Netherland became the state, the province of New York. And when that happened, so many Massachusetts people raised their hands and said, wait a minute. We own a huge swath of this new province. And I was like, what are you talking about? Well, on their charter, the charter for many of these colonies, if you remember, like you go back to your middle school or high school history, and you'd see the map of the 13 colonies, and they kind of look like the 13 corresponding states did, except many of them would have this territorial claim as wide as the state extending over the Pacific Ocean. What's up with that? Well, it's because the charters, the legal charters granting these land and a proprietor or whoever had the title from the king, usually read something like, this colony begins at Farmer Wilson's Rock and extends to the willow tree on the other bank of this river and continues to the west to the next ocean, wherever that is. And they thought the ocean was a lot closer than it was. They had no idea. But so legally speaking, Massachusetts stood up and said, hey, we own a Massachusettsian-wide strip of all of upstate New York, millions of acres by our charter. Give it to us. Well, they lost that battle because the province of New York was named for the Duke of York, the king's brother, who was the proprietor of the colony, so that wasn't going to happen. But by way of compensation, the crown gave not sovereignty, but land title to all these millions of acres of upstate New York directly to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, who then assigned trusted colonization efforts, usually led by a congregational or Presbyterian clergy, bringing his townspeople from his town in large family groups to go on the new New York frontier and set out to deploy as groups, like a little toolkit, your New England village with its, taxpayer finance public school, its town green, the meeting house, town meeting form of government, and all the rest, which is why if you go in the whole middle strip of upstate New York and you go to the old parts of town, they kind of resemble classic New England towns because that's who settled those zones. People in New Netherlands, the Dutch settled zone, hated all of this, right? They tried to secede at the beginning of the Civil War, not to join the South, but to get away from what they described as their evil Puritan overlords in Albany, right? It's two different cultures. Anyway, so they claimed upstate New York. Then, in the early Republic period, this all played out again, because when the Northwest Territory was being broken up by the federal government, they were creating the Ohio Territory, Connecticut raised their hand and said, wait a minute, if you go west from Connecticut, there's a Connecticutian-wide strip of Ohio that belongs to us, right? The Western Reserve of Connecticut. That's that dark blue bit out there around Cleveland on Lake Erie. And the federal government's like, no, we're not going to give you sovereignty. There's not going to be a Western Connecticut Reserve, but you can have land title. And so that part of Ohio, and only that part of Ohio, was settled by Connecticuters, which is why if you look on Google Maps or Rand Valley, you'll see all these Connecticut place names in that zone, because that's where the settlers were from. Go forward another generation, creation of Michigan Territory, who were the initial settlers? Well, a lot of them, because it was a timber place, they were looking for who knows who invented the industrial techniques of the 19th century lumber industry. Bangor and North, the main lumberjack people were coming down the Erie Canal, right, in huge numbers and manning the forest there. But the leadership groups who were actually convening to form the territorial governments and setting out for the state constitutional conventions where they wrote the state constitutions and set out all the institutions and laws were all from the Yankee settled Western Reserve of Ohio, the Yankee settled upstate New York, or New England itself, which provided something like 5 of the first 6 territorial and state governors of Michigan. And then fast forward on, you can tell a similar story for Wisconsin and Minnesota and those other bits. So that's what it's mapping, those institutions, and you could tell a similar story for all these other regional cultures, but that's all it's mapping. Everything else is pretty much let the chips fall as they may, and all the rest of the data and other things I'm going to show you. These cultures, though, don't agree on a lot of things. They don't agree, for instance, on how to create a society where humans can be maximally and sustainably free. In doing this, you emphasize individual liberty, as the Scots-Irish and collective culture of Greater Appalachia does, or the common good, as did those Puritans, who believed that they were in that Old Testament-style covenant with God and had been tasked to create a more godly society here on the American frontier. In other words, is freedom ultimately about maximizing the autonomy of the individual, about personal sovereignty and a lack of restraints, especially, but not exclusively, from government? If we had less government, less taxes, less regulation, is it not axiomatic that each of us as an individual be more free? Or is it that freedom is about building and maintaining the infrastructure and institutions of a free society? The schools and parks, roads and bridges, public universities, libraries and clinics that act as a leveling mechanism to ensure that each person has a fair shot at achieving their potential of being meaningfully free, regardless of the circumstances of their birth? Is it, in other words, a shared endeavor, a social project, the cultivation of a Republican citizenry? My answer, laid out in this 2016 book, American Character, is that an optimally functioning liberal democracy has to maintain a balance between these two essential elements of freedom, right? To get them in equilibrium. Because hey, if you run in extremis in either direction, you don't end up in freedom, you wind up in tyranny. If you keep on going, eliminating government taxes and everything until there's no government, no regulation, and no taxes, each individual is not wonderfully free from the terrible oppression of government. We know what's happened time and time again in history is the most rapacious families among us maximize their freedom and take it away from everyone else, and you're in an oligarchy. But hey, you go in the other direction, and you keep maximizing the common good as held by the communitarian keepers of the common good, and those keepers start getting worried about the idiosyncrasies and deviances of each individual human out there who are starting to mess things up, and that becomes a problem pretty much since it becomes criminalized. You're supposed to surrender to the superego of the keeper of the common good, the fatherland, the party, and end up committing thought crimes. And you opt up in that world of Orwell, Hitler and Stalin. Well, that's not so good either. But the key is that if you think about those both being extremists, where does the maximum moment of liberal democracy, of human freedom exist? It's when you hit that magic sweet spot where the two are in equilibrium. That's why it's so difficult, right? You can't just run to extreme. You got to find the 50-yard line and keep yourself on it in all kinds of changing circumstances. And humans have only been trying to do this. Let's try to make all individuals equally have moral equality and be equally free and not be tyrannized. That's ideas only about 4 centuries old. We've only been trying to do it for less than 3. We're not very good at it yet. It's a tricky thing to do. And each society is going to have a little bit different central balance point, right? Japan's is going to be more communitarian than Australia's, for instance. And in our case, what makes things particularly difficult is that our regional cultures that make up our federation don't agree on where the balance point should be, or even if there should be a balance point at all. Here's a map showing the orientation of the centuries-old cultural values of the different regions you saw before. In shades of purple are the individualistic regions: Deep South, Greater Appalachia, Far West, legacy Tidewater, which is the Chesapeake country. And in shades of green are the communitarian-oriented ones. Yankeedom's the greater New England cultural space, New Netherland, the Dutch settled zone that survives around greater New York City. The Midlands, legacy of William Penn and the Quakers' experiment in Delaware Bay, creating a pluralistic society where anybody can come and you can keep your culture forever, right? There's no dominant culture at all. That's a mosaic of peoples who share a political space, not a cultural one. The left coast, that Chile-shaped strip along the narrow plain of the Pacific between about Monterey, California and Juneau, Alaska, settled by a combination of Appalachian settlers traveling overland in wagon trains over the far west to colonize primarily the countryside, and New Englanders coming by ship, a more comfortable way to set up the cities, creating a hybrid culture. And El Norte, which is the Spanish settled borderlands. And you can see matches to a great degree the settlement patterns you saw on that slide earlier. As you learn in Nations Apart, this difference in orientations has had profound ramifications on present-day policy issues in general and our country's stability overall. One example, our politics, up until about 2016 anyway, had centered on this question of individual liberty or the common good, which is why you see these patterns in the American nations map reflected so often in county-level election results of any hotly contested presidential election. Again, you have to look at the county level, right? Because the states don't capture the regional cultures. This is the 1916 presidential map, Woodrow Wilson versus Charles Hughes, where Republicans, yes, in red, were the party of communitarian values, and Democrats, in blue, were the party of individual liberty and racial apartheid. Notice communitarian Yankeedom all the way down to chunks of the Western Reserve, Ohio, and Michigan, Wisconsin, and such were aligned with the former, and the individualistic regions aligned with the latter. Pretty wild. And then there's this map. That's 2008. Barack Obama versus John McCain. Same map pretty much, 2012 map. In fact, many of our maps look exactly like this. It's pretty much the same map, except the colors have been reversed, because by this time, the two parties had finished their half-century exchange of platforms, ideologies, and regional constituencies. You will notice that no longer is the Deep South and Tidewater monochrome single-party state, and you can suddenly see El Norte where you couldn't see it before. What changed between 1916 and 2008? African Americans and Latino Americans could actually vote, and you're seeing that reflected on the map. But this affects much more than just politics. It affects all manner of things in American life. For instance, the response to a contagious, deadly airborne virus. You can see in this map how the individual liberty nations hobbled the United States' response to the COVID-19 pandemic, where people and elected officials resisted mask wearing and vaccines, and this is vaccine uptake as mapped by nationhood lab by regional culture as of August 15th, 2021. Why then? Well, that was a time when, miraculously, vaccines had been invented, in fact, competing ones that all worked, and by August, for several weeks, the distribution and supply chain problems had been solved. You could actually just go and get it. You didn't have to stand in line and stuff. And by that point, anybody who wanted it could get it. If you didn't have it yet, it meant it wasn't a priority to you, or you really didn't want to get it, or you had a medical reason not to be able to. The key point, though, is if you look at those, you probably can't see those numbers, but some of the communitarian regions, like Yankeedom or Left Coast, at that point had almost double the primary vaccination rate of the Deep South. And this from the New York Times, not unrelated, they are the county-level COVID-19 deaths per capita at the end of that very same summer. My academic partners recently calculated the final death tallies from the CDC. Statistically, they declared that February 23rd, 2023 was the end of the pandemic. As of that date, the Deep South had lost 505 people per 100,000 residents to COVID-19. If you do the math, that's almost 250,000 dead. That's also 2.5 times the proportion who died in the left coast, 195 per 100,000, even though the left coast population is overwhelmingly concentrated in urban areas, epidemiologically not an advantage. It's also 5 times the rate of death in Hawaii, part of the greater Polynesian cultural space, a communitarian region which, being an island, was able to effectively seal itself off and provides a control sample for what might have been possible. But you see these regional divides in the prevalence of diseases that aren't epidemics, like here's diabetes prevalence from CDC data as processed by my team and our academic collaborators at the Health Partners Institute in Minneapolis and the University of Illinois, Chicago. Blue is good, red is bad, and as you can see, Deep South and Greater Appalachia have a problem. And this is obesity. And this is life expectancy. As my project revealed in a viral Politico story I wrote in 2023, we found 3 to 5 year population level differences in life expectancy between the large regional cultures. Now that might not sound like a ton, but 3 to 5 years is comparable to the gap separating the United States from Bulgaria, Libya, and the Philippines for 3, 4, and 5 years. And the gaps don't go away when we parse by race, urbanity or ruralness of the county, impoverishment levels in the county, education levels in the county, or access to quality health care as measured by an outside group per county. These, from the Washington Post, are FICO consumer credit scores by county. Blue is bad, gold is good. Now think about that. There are lots of very, very rich counties in that blue blob. And there's a lot of very, very poor ones in the gold one. Look at Washington County, right? Poorest county in the Northeast, often gets that crown. And yet, look in Ohio. Look at the difference between Metro Cincinnati and Metro Cleveland, core, suburbs, and all. Even though, by almost any measure, Cleveland is a poorer metro area these days than Cincinnati. There's clearly something going on there. Little appreciated is how much the incidence of gun violence. I put it that way. Like so many salient issues in American life, varies by region. Here, again, using CDC data, we map the per capita rate for gun deaths by county between 2010 and 2020 inclusive. The Deep South's annual per capita rate of 15.6 per 100,000 residents is about double that of Yankeedom, and about 4 times that of New Netherland, again, greater New York City, most diverse and densely populated part of the entire continent, whose rate of 3.8 per 100,000 isn't much higher than that of Switzerland. The gaps, by the way, persist or even grow wider if you look at just urban counties between the regions, or just rural counties between the regions, or look at just gun homicides, or just gun suicides, or just where the victim was white, or just where the victim was black, and so on. Looking at history, here is every fatal white supremacist mob action in the United States between 1835 and 1964, both lynchings and riots, as mapped by the Monroe Work Today Research Group. The orange dots represent an incident where an African American was killed. The yellow ones are for Latino victims. The presence of these regional cultures also profoundly affected 19th century immigration. This, also from Census Bureau data, is the percentage of foreign-born people in 1900 by county. And we know this because the census takers said, hey, foreign-born or not? And so this is like individualized data all tabulated together. So we actually know the answers at the county level. Notice that essentially nobody from that immigration wave went to the Deep South, Tidewater, or Greater Appalachia, right? 1%, 3.5%. Well, the other regions are 17, 25, even 30% foreign-born. Think of the delta, think of the enormous difference in the concentration of immigrants. And that, in turn, further reinforced identity and demographic differences between the regions. And it also, in turn, affected the distribution of religious traditions today. Here from the American Association of Statisticians of Religious Bodies U.S. Religion Census are the dominant religions in each county today. Red is Southern Baptist. You can see that on the line between Methodist Belt and Midlands, which makes sense. Gray is LDS, or the Mormons. And blue, dominating most of the map, is Roman Catholic. The largest religious group amid that great 1880 to 1924 immigration wave that so profoundly changed ideas about American identity, forcing, like you say, Protestant America, kicking and screaming, to accept that henceforth Catholics, Orthodox Christians, and Jews, at least, could be full-fledged Americans. Except none of that happened in those southern regions, because there were no immigrants to force the issue. That red Baptist zone you see there is the legacy of the spatial maldistribution of the great immigration wave. And today is the only part of the country where Christian nationalism in capitals, the notion that America is rightly an evangelical Protestant nation and was founded by to be so, it's the only region where that can find fertile soil. Because if you're in any of the other regions, you walk around and you're like, oh, that's clearly not the case, right? I mean, Maine's white, rural, relatively poor, and we have almost no evangelicals compared to the South. You know, if that's God's plan, it's not working very well. But if you're in that red zone, which is almost exactly Greater Appalachia, Deep South, and Tidewater, if you look at the county level, and I didn't make this map, it would make perfect sense, right? You have a distorted view and you sort of assume the rest of the country shares these characteristics, and it doesn't. Here is a detailed crowdsourced map of American dialects today by the internet researcher Rick Ashman, which, like many of these other data sets I'm showing you, came out years after I wrote the book and issued the map. What Ashman says, he had this website, and he said, hey, come to my website and, tell me your zip code where you live now, not where you're from, not where your people are from, where you happen to live right now, and record for me and send me the sound file, this little script. And then being a linguist, you did things or whatever they do to sort out the taxonomy, and you just sorted it out based on where people are now. And the dark blue lines are the major domains. Notice the degree to which they echo the American nation settlement patterns, which when you think about it, kind of makes sense that they would follow one from the other. And this one really surprised me. It even left a mark on genetics. Right, as American nations, this whole thing is not about genetics and bloodlines, it's about cultural transmission, right? In New Netherlands now, I can give you a whole argument as to why the reason New York City is different than everywhere else on the continent is because it is a Dutch city with the fundamental characteristics of Golden Age Amsterdam. But today, it's like 0.02% Dutch, right? It's not the people. The people are long gone, but they formatted the cultural zone. In fact, the Dutch were never a majority, even in the colonial period. It was this diverse place. It was a village of 800 people at the end of Manhattan Island. It was already this polyglot, multi-religious, multi-ethnic trading entrepot as a village plugged into two major empires, unlike anywhere else, again, on the continent. So this study came out back in 2017, yeah, even on the slide, in the journal Nature Communications. And it came from scientists at Ancestry.com, right? The people you stick the Q-tip in your nose and send it off, and they sequence your genome, come back to a little report that says, no, you're not Lithuanian American. And that man's not your father, right? All kinds of But if you also check the box and said you can use this for research, and 70,000 people had at the time that the Ancestry folks crunched this data, they took your sequenced genome and they fed it into a supercomputer alongside the other 799,999 people's entire genomes. And they tasked the computer just look for people who are more closely related than they ought to be. And because it's Ancestry, they also have your family tree. So they know that your great-great-grandmother on this side in this branch was born in this town and died in that one, so they could map back the clusters they found. And that's the map they posted, which people started pinging me after this paper came out on social media because they recognized the American nations patterns. I interviewed them and did a little story out. They never heard of American nations. But you can see, to a remarkable degree, like I would never have guessed that there would be a genetic imprint in Michigan from that early settlement drive. Or you can see the Midland zone there. The Mormons were all Yankees, started on the Yankee frontier, and they're all actually escaping to their Zion there, so that's not a surprise. And one piece of fascinating information, though, is that Greater Appalachia, which started up in the top corner there in southwestern Pennsylvania, the Quakers had an open immigration policy, no one else did. At the time, the big demand to get out of Europe was Scots-Irish leaving Ulster and Lowland Scots leaving the borderlands of Britain, and they all moved to southwestern Pennsylvania, the frontier, and then they spread down the Appalachian frontier. This tracks it, but the fascinating piece of information is they broke on both sides of the Appalachian Ridge, right? You can see the difference between that purple and that red is the difference between cycling there. So anyway, even the most important decisions people make, who am I going to hook up with and create a family, ended up being linked by region, even though there were people right nearby in the same colony who belonged to another settlement stream. That's not the way it deviated from the map. So, my point in all of these slides is that the divides are real between the regions. They matter, and they matter a lot for democracy and much else besides. So that brings us to the second question. What holds us together given all that? What's ever held us together? Because the regional cultures, those 6 eastern ones I showed you in that very first slide anyway, wound up together in an accident of history. They came together in 1776 to confront a common threat to each of their own ways of doing things, a change in British imperial policy. So they gathered together, formed a ragtag rebel alliance, and miraculously, they won. And in doing so, they found themselves inside something called the United States of America. But nobody was really sure what that was. In other words, the United States came together initially as a contractual agreement, a means to an end for the parties involved. Nobody thought that they had just created a nation state in the sense that Holland or Prussia or post-revolutionary France were. Everyone knew that its people lacked a shared history, religion, or ethnicity, that they didn't speak a unique language that was all their own, that they hadn't occupied the continent long enough to have some sense of living in a mythic homeland since the mists of time and being descended upon their understanding, and they killed or pushed out, or were still pushing out, the very people who could make such claims. They lacked a shared political heritage, apart from the imperial ties they had just rebelled against. In short, they had none of the foundations, the building blocks of the nation state that the Europeans were using at exactly the same time to start creating theirs. They had no story to bring and hold themselves together. Now, such stories are required of every nation, Germany or Hungary or Japan or India or ourselves. Because think about it, to have fealty to something as abstract as a nation, to feel that we owe it greater loyalty than we do to people than we do to other nations, that we're bound to its fellow members more than we are to other humans who are not members. Why is it that we have more in common here in Maine with somebody in Southern California than we do with the people in New Brunswick that share our, environment, cultural background, and all the rest. That we might ultimately literally give our lives to it. That requires a compelling and credible story. An idea that's evocative and feels true on some level. That has footings in the past and gives us that answer for why it is that we're part of one community. A society without such a credible story, the historian William McNeill wrote almost 50 years ago, soon finds itself in deep trouble. For in the absence of believable myths, coherent public action becomes very difficult to improvise or to sustain. But our national story had to be created ex post facto, decades after the creation of the country, starting in the 1830s, really, a story I told in my penultimate book, Union. That story is the one thing that's held us together, more or less, ever since. But it's been contested from the outset. That story said, yes, we may lack a shared history, religion, or ethnicity, but what we share are a set of ideals, the ones from that famous passage in the Declaration of Independence. It's laying out the inherent quality of humans, their rights to life and liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and representative self-government. To be an American, according to this story, is to be committed to this set of propositions about the nature of the universe and humans' place in it. These are good ideals. Think about it. A natural right granted to all humans by God or nature or the universe to not be tyrannized, to pursue happiness as we each understand it, and have equal access to the representative self-government that makes that all possible. And that we are in a covenant as Americans to protect one another's rights to these things. And these are the ideals that Frederick Douglass was fighting for in every single speech the guy gave. This is Lincoln at Gettysburg and Martin Luther King Jr. on the Mall. It's the civic national ideal, the American promise. But those ideals were contested immediately and in real time from the 1830s onward by a counter-narrative, first crafted by a circle of deep Southern intellectuals who said, no, the Declaration is wrong. Humans are not equal. Only the superior Anglo-Saxon race, they said, had the genius and ability to secure those promises in the Declaration. We're a classical republic, like ancient Greece or Rome, right? Where a small minority has the privilege or liberty to practice democracy, and subjugation and slavery are the natural lot of the many. It was an ethno-national and inherently authoritarian vision. But that vision had millennia of political history and philosophy behind it. The other vision was this new radical upstart idea. The battle between those two visions of America has been our eternal struggle. It's the great meta struggle of America, right? This was the fight throughout the antebellum period, and the Civil War, and Reconstruction, and Southern Redemption, and the Jim Crow period, and the Civil Rights Movement, and it's the struggle now. The ethno-nationalists actually ruled this country in the 1910s and 1920s in a federation-wide consensus. And the first deep Southern president, Woodrow Wilson, segregated the federal government. When we were putting up those Confederate statues, we were until recently tearing down. When Birth of a Nation was all the rage, a film literally celebrating the KKK's successful terrorist campaign to restore white supremacy in the occupied South. That's the plot of the film. When the 1924 Immigration Act imposed racial quotas to defend the alleged Anglo-Saxon character of the country. The civic national vision didn't win the argument and become the federation-wide consensus for the first time until the 1960s, when the Civil Rights Movement toppled Southern apartheid and challenged Northern racism, when the feminist movement demanded social, professional, and sexual equality for a gender that comprised the majority of the population, when gays and lesbians fought the police and discriminatory ordinances, an era when elite colleges began partially dismantling their old boy networks, and public universities rapidly expanded to increase educational opportunities. Congress passed a new immigration law in 1965 that repealed the ethno-racial quotas, reopening America's gates to humanity at large. While the new generation of historians challenged the neo-Confederate narrative of American history that had dominated secondary school, public high school textbooks at that point for half a century, while dispelling the innocence of the American colonization of the continent. And that's when we became what political scientists would call a liberal democracy for the first time. Not in the 1860s, the 1960s, in living memory. Right? None of it is inevitable. It's an incredible gift, and one that had to be fought for and continues to have to be fought for. Because the forces of autocracy and ethno-nationalism have again seized power. And they have their narrative, their story of the kind of country they're fighting for and building, all worked out. To return America to the imagined greatness of the world as it was before that civic national triumph. The problem is, the rest of America doesn't have their story worked out. And that's most of us, actually. The 75 to 80% of Americans who polls repeatedly show don't want to live in an ethno-national authoritarian world. We, if I may, have lost our story, our message. We, that latent, transpartisan, ecumenical, pro-democracy supermajority. Americans were never that great at talking about what our ideals mean in practice. They weren't very good at it in the 18th century, we weren't that good at it in the late 20th, but we stopped even trying after we won the Cold War. And a vacuum opened up, and demagogues stepped right in, as they always do. We need that story now. And that's the work we've been doing at Nation Lab. The testing, polling, and crafting of an emotive, effective American story. One that can recenter and revitalize what should have been America's ideals and values for all of these past 250 years. Now, when our work got underway in earnest in end of 2024, we met with an unexpected and very happy surprise. This effort is greatly aided by the fact that this story of civic national purpose falls on a very sympathetic audience. In our preliminary baseline national poll, we asked registered voters which statements about the nature of the United States they most agreed with. We offered statement pairs with each question. Statement pairs about our national purpose, about American identity, about the meaning of our past. And in each case, one of the competing statements was keyed off the ideals in the Declaration, the other rooted in more intrinsic characteristics, like ancestry, heritage, character, and values. Now, I thought that the latter was going to win at the outset, that Nation Lab's task would be to get Americans to eat their broccoli. It's good for you, right? That other stuff will kill you, don't do it. But, it tastes so good, right? That because the Declaration's values sound so abstract and lofty, and the other ones feel so concrete. So I was really surprised when that proved not to be the case at all. The civic values proved to be more attractive regardless of gender, age, race, education, or even regional culture. 63% of Americans preferred the statement that we were united, quote, by our shared commitment to a set of American founding ideals, that we all have inherent and equal rights to live, to not be tyrannized, and pursue happiness as we understand it, over a counter option, embraced by just 33% of respondents, that said we are instead united, quote, by shared history, traditions, and values, and by our fortitude and character as Americans, a people who value hard work, individual responsibility, and national loyalty. Now, I put up some crosstabs from that particular question up here. You may not be able to read the details. The civic version, though, is in green, and as you can see by the length of the bars, was the favorite for most all the demographic categories, generation, education level, and so on. With two major exceptions towards the bottom, where the orange bars are longer. Those are Republicans and people who said they voted for Donald Trump in 2020. But still, 45% of both of those segments prefer the Declaration, joining 63% of independents and 79% of Democrats. Now, as a starting point, before we've done anything at all, these were really encouraging numbers and totally unexpected. We later, in another poll, decided we better test whether or not Americans agree with this argument, this covenant argument that we're all duty-bound to protect one another's rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Because if it's just, anyone I want, that's not a basis for a cohesion or a union, right? So we thought we better test it out. It's like, oh, well, I hope this comes out 60-30, 60-40 like the other ones. So I was blown away when the numbers came back 97-2 in favor of that proposition. 97-2. You don't hear 97-2 in anything. It was one of the widest margins of any question our pollsters had ever encountered. Any question asked, we've never seen those numbers. If you ask Americans, is the earth round or flat? And the good people at the Pew Research Center have, it's 80-10. With 10% undecided. 97-2 is low sufficiency territory, right? I mean, this means that, obviously not everyone's acting on that, but subconsciously it really is burned into us culturally as Americans that this is our purpose. And that's something you can definitely work with. So we subsequently worked to optimize our messaging by additional national polls and batteries of one-on-one detailed interviews where you could talk to representative respondents set up by our pollsters. And in the end, we devised what communications people call a core narrative frame. And that's just a one-pager. You'll find it unpacked in great detail if you pick out Nations Apart in the last chapter. You can also read it in this summary form in this free PDF you can find at nationsatlab.org. The whole thing's 12 pages laying out what's the national narrative. Here's the numbers. Here's what we learned. And you have the one-pager and also a conservative-only audience variations that work slightly better with only conservatives, but don't use it with everyone else because it repels the other groups, but you have those two there. And so I encourage you to check those out because it's not enough to be against authoritarian ethno-nationalism or personalist dictatorships. A small d democratic coalition also has to be for something. This is a message about what we're for, about the world the rest of us are trying to create. And when I say we, I mean it expansively, right? A massive transpartisan coalition that can stretch from Liz Cheney to Liz Warren, where people who might otherwise identify as liberals, conservatives, Republicans, Democrats, independents, communists, Greens, libertarians can all find common cause in defending and upholding the American experiment. So I hope you enjoy this and much else within the covers of the book or at Nation Lab, and I thank you very much for your time.
The most amazing thing was the map showing the different colors related to different conditions of American society. But can you relate how what is called corporate America evolved and began to have some control over how, for instance, expansion took place? Thinking about trade and all that other stuff and transportation. But corporate America is such a big deal for us now. It's like a second government.
Yeah.
And so how does that relate?
Yeah, a couple, three thoughts on that. I mean, broadly speaking, I think, economics and business are actually downstream of culture and the environment and context we create. But in the story of the far west, that interior area, that is totally reversed. Right? When I go to my American Nations talk, when I describe all these regions, the far west is the one region where I admit all this ethnographic stuff and Dr. First Assembly goes out the window because the environment at the time that this colonization was taking place in the second half of the 19th century was so hostile and overwhelming at the tech level that people had at the time. It was remote, it was high, it wasn't enough water, it was an incredibly difficult place. It essentially stopped. The reason you see all those borders stopping at about the 100th is because at that point we need irrigation systems to practice agriculture. All of the folk agricultural traditions of all of the different cultures were just stopped in their tracks there. They tried to go on. They had a theory that rain would follow the plow, right? If you plowed it, it would rain more. And instead it caused this massive dust bowl. Times people had to flee. Basically, you couldn't push on beyond that point without major infrastructure. So that whole zone you see there, the interior far west that was not Spanish settled, it had to be settled by first the corporations coming in or the federal government and laying down massive industrial scale infrastructure before the colonization takes place. The railroads, aluminum smelters, copper mines, interbasin water transfers. I mean, crazy level stuff. And so like the railroads would actually like lay out towns on their routes and would go to Europe and recruit people in, the Rhine Valley and give them through tickets. Here's your ticket for the steamer, then you get on a train, and then we deposit you in the new town we're creating. It wasn't like the rest of the country where, when a town gets big enough, somebody entrepreneurial builds a railroad to improve things. No, the railroad comes first. The aluminum smelter comes first, and then the people were employed. And it was treated like a resource colony for, Anaconda Copper and, the Union Pacific Railroad. These entities owned the territories, or the federal government, owned all the land, controlled the legislatures. The legislators then chose who the U.S. senators were. I mean, it was, the corporations created that and the federal government together. And the resentment in the far west is profound. They know that they were treated as an internal resource colony for the benefit of these corporations based in San Francisco and Chicago and Boston. And the resentment of that control, and yet the dependency the region has on all those things has this schizophrenic far western culture. At times, like in the post-war period, the big demon torturing far westerners were considered to be the corporations. So it was this center of populist senators on church and stuff. And then it kind of flipped where the biggest danger seemed to be the federal government controlling all the land, and it shifted in that sagebrush revolution kind of stance. But it's a funny animal. So that played a big role there. The other regions, not as much as you think. Corporate behavior you can examine between regions. There's people, professors doing entrepreneurial studies, finding the differences between the regional cultures in terms of different kinds of business. Like if you're involved in extractive industries, you do much better in the individualistic regions basically. But if you're involved in the knowledge and tech, more of the startups happen in the communitarian ones when you need the assets and stuff to make things go. So yeah, but again, it's a subset. It follows from those things. Thanks for the question.
So you mentioned a transpartisan spectrum from Liz Cheney to Liz Warren. Is anybody on our current political landscape speaking that language that can embrace that part of the spectrum?
Yeah. Yes, but it's tricky. I mean, you go back in time, and that was, he was picking the wrong time and had too much faith, but Obama's whole thing in his first election cycle was that, right? He was creating the shared experience based on the declaration that will pull us together. We somehow thought that was going to play out in the negotiations over the health care bill in the Senate, which you should have known as a senator wasn't going to happen, but he was arguing those things. Are there people who are trying to make that pitch now? Yeah, kind of. It's only though, unfortunately, I've been talking about this stuff for almost a decade, that authoritarian threat and get focused and set on values. Only in the past year, and especially since Minneapolis, are people really realizing that we're already a hybrid regime, right? We're no longer a free democracy. We're not yet an authoritarian regime, right? We're having free and fair elections, the opposition parties winning and taking office, so it's not a dictatorship, but we're in between the two, right? And that's a dangerous zone, and that's starting to wake people up who I don't pay attention to politics. Politics pays attention to you. It's not a hobby, right? And so enough of that. Once you wake the sleeping giant, though, confronted with what's happening, probably 70% of Americans are against what's going on, right? That masked federal agents can go shoot anybody and no one can investigate them. That people who aren't U.S. citizens don't have the rights in the Constitution and the Declaration. Of course they do, right? Everybody does. Until a year ago, that wasn't questioned, right? It protects everybody who's in the United States at any time. They're U.S. citizens. So that factor is waking people up. And as people are waking up and institutions are doing it, everyone's like, well, what's our story? What pulls us together? They're looking for the language. The grasping around, you see it in editorials and way politicians and leaders are talking. They're all realizing we need this, and it happens to be the 250th year of the Declaration of founding of the country. And so that is shortcutting people to realize that the Declaration is the set of ideals that you can build that on. So it's happening. It's just happening, years too late, but it is happening now. You're hearing it in bits and pieces now, more and more from politicians, intellectual leaders, community leaders, whoever's out there starting to talk about it. but.
In a way that both ends of the spectrum can hear.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, the size of the big tent, who wants to defend the American experiment, is huge. It's trying to get around, we're so trained to, like, do it through the partisan lens, which is not what we need right now. You should not be saying that to defend the American experiment in the Declaration, you have to join Team Big D Democrat, right? Because there's people who, I don't like the Democrats, I'm a Republican, I'm a Libertarian, I don't want to join them. But it should be, no, you're joining Team Defend the American Experiment. That for these purposes, Liz Cheney and Liz Warren who agree on nothing else, but they agree on this, right? That we can join together in that. That's what's needed, is the rhetoric of the movement, the actual American experiment, American promise movement. And unfortunately, people are only getting it now because somehow Americans in general wouldn't believe that this can happen here. Even though it already did, right? We went through Reconstruction and all that kind of stuff in the past. So, yeah, better lead than that.
Thank you so much for your talk. Really appreciate it. It's so organic, the sense of the spread, like the first settlements and then the spread, and the culture and the ideology. It almost has a tone to it. It's like dropping dye into certain parts of the country and then watching where that dye spreads out.
Yeah, and that dye will, a river system here or this crop works there will affect where the dye flowed. But yeah, once it flows, it leaves a mark that's kind of indelible to a degree that surprises me.
Yeah, and I'm going to take you back to the beginnings and wonder if you would say something more about this. My understanding was that those folks that settled the Massachusetts Bay Colony were families. They were family oriented. They had a little bit of money, and they brought
middle class.
And class. They were educated, and they brought their whole families with them, which created a structure. In fact, northern New England, or New England, had some of the oldest living family members under one roof of any place in the world at that time, because they had left the constraints and the pollution of England and came to a more pristine environment. But the Tidewater folks were settlers of the second, third, or fourth sons of moneyed English, and they weren't that well educated, and they didn't come with families. And that had a profound effect, in my understanding, on how that political environment sort of grew. So you had a sort of family environment that valued reading, writing, education, and sort of a second or third son environment that didn't bring a family and didn't have that social structure. I wonder if you'd say something about that.
That's true. I mean, New England was unusual among the colonies. Like that, only the Yankee space and the Midlands was it characteristic that the people coming to settle were coming in intact family groups. You have an entire family group, sometimes multiple generations, all moving together. And in Yankeedom, like they would come, and it wasn't, each individual, like Greater Appalachia, each individual goes out and cuts down their, log cabin in the woods and, defends it themselves from everyone. It was the entire group goes and they deploy a town based on more or less equitably dividing the plots of the town, and it's all with the indigenous people, but they've laid out the plots and where the town green will be and where they can build a church. It was all done as a communal, unpack the kit enterprise. And that was the only region where that took place. So you fast forward to the 1820s when de Tocqueville's wandering around, and he's expected to run into peasants like Europe, and he's out in the frontier in Wisconsin or wherever he was, or Illinois, and looks under a rock, and there's what should be a peasant family living there because they're reading the Iliad. He's like, whoa, how can we read the Iliad? You're involved in your town council stuff. It's because of that whole tradition. That was not the case, though, when you go down to the Tidewater and the south, right? That was, second, third, fourth, fifth sons of the English country manor families. The ones, firstborn son inherits the estate, and the rest of you are, kind of spares. Go out, be a soldier, maybe you'll die. Off you go, right? But suddenly, with discovering the New World, it was possible to imagine that you could go and create a new estate. You could create your own manor. That's what they were trying to do. They were trying to just recreate the feudal Lord Granthams and Downton Abbeys of the late 17th century. And so that's what they were trying to create. So they may have been relatively educated, but the point was they were going to be the heads of a sort of neo-feudal manor system where everyone else would hands. right? And you don't have a public education system there. You didn't have a public education system really till after the Civil War in the Deep South and Tidewater. If you were the planter families, you had tutor to teach your kids, or you sent them to Eton or to Phillips Exeter and Andover and then on to Princeton later on. That's how it's out there. And if you couldn't afford those things, well, tough luck, right? And so there was no education system. So you can imagine the differences that made. That the Southern intellectuals, and what I wrote about in Union, who were trying to fight for ethno-nationalism and for a deep Southern identity, William Gilmore's, they themselves are just completely frustrated because they're trying to start journals. They're trying to write books and stuff. And like they're having to go to New York City to get their books printed. There's no printing industry. They can't get anyone to subscribe to the journals, even the planters. The planters, stiffly don't like that, pay them for the subscriptions. Like just the ability to compete with this giant Yankee machine. Just saying, the Pilgrims landed and they were freedom loving, and that was the American story. It's like, wait a minute, it was the whole rest of the country that were just drowned out by the power of the intellectual machinery that had been built in Yankeedom. So that, that distorted our story in many ways for a long time. How many people know that Maine was settled before the Puritans showed up, or before the Pilgrims and Mayflower voyages that we had year-round fishing stations in the Maine coast because they got pushed out by the Harvard, Yale historians who were writing the story of their great-grandfathers. Yes, please.
I've talked to a lot of people in recent times who say that one way to get over some of our depression about current affairs is to read about other times in American history when things were also at a low point.
Yeah.
And I'm happy that I read your book, American Character, where you talk about all of those low times. Not just the Civil War, there were a lot of other times when things were pretty low. And I'm reading your reviewer here who says that about your new book, despite your solution-oriented mindset, you see little prospect of rapprochement in any time in the near future. I'm also impressed by the fact I didn't get all the way through American Character because by the time I got all the way to the end, it just seemed like it was terribly out of date.
Right.
It was printed in 2016.
Written in 2015, came out.
It was printed in 2016. Yeah, in 2016 was an interesting year in our history because it was a presidential election year. And would you argue that the acceleration of the deterioration has increased greatly over the past 9 or 10 years?
Oh, yeah.
And is that a way that we're going to motivate more people?
Yeah, I mean, greatest crisis since, the Civil War for sure, and in some ways, more dangerous, right? Because it's the technology we have. If you had a, dictatorship form, look at China's surveillance state through AI and facial recognition and cameras everywhere, and military strength in the United States, its intelligence apparatus, and its process. I mean, it would be really bad. I don't think it's going to happen though, because one thing you know from political science is, authoritarian populists seize power because they're popular. They've got backing of a whole bunch of people who let them do it, right? All of this stuff is not popular, right? I mean, Trump said that he was going to do all these things, but people didn't believe him in the Times and Washington Post, like saying Washington, oh, he won't do that, right? No, he's doing exactly what he said he would do, and people hate it, right? His numbers are collapsing all the way around because, only about 20-45% of Americans want an ethno-national authoritarian Anglo-Protestant Christian nationalist state. The rest of us actually don't, and as people are waking up, that's shifting. But again, people don't pay attention very closely. So yeah, I think we escaped that, but the danger is in a certain sense greater because the power of DC and the federal government, in 1865, the technology was not at all as pervasive as it would be today. Yes, sir?
How do you believe I should best communicate if I have, say, family or friends that live in a region like the Deep South, who maybe are very partisan or only believe in certain ideologies, only watch certain news channels, and maybe, they have these very strict ideologies. And so for example, they mention far left violence, and then I'll ask them about a person who was shot by, say, ICE or the Proud Boys, and they'll say maybe they deserve it. How do you think I should best communicate with those kinds of people without raising conflict?
It's tricky, right? I mean, the previous questioner said, you quoting the review about, the opportunities for rapprochement. I mean, I think there is opportunities for rapprochement for the 70%, that last 20%, or getting the, legacy culture of the Deep South on board the Declaration. is hard. The Deep South is going to have a revolution is what will happen, right? Because you have a built-in, if you have a caste society, you have a built-in 40% of the population who has never been down in the fundamental political culture of the place, and you just add, suburbanization, and you get Georgia in the last election cycle, right? So I mean, it's unlike Great Appalachian, which has none of those features. So I mean, there can be change. I think that all kinds of ways that you can get the soft supporter who's not like totally in on all of that. There's a dedicated group, and it's just a separate epistemological space. They're living in their own information environment with their own facts, and you can't, in my experience, can't break through if they're really on board with that. But there's a whole other hat, like, of the Trump supporters, a good half of them are not that. They don't actually agree with any of those things and are disturbed by it. You can totally have a conversation based on the fundamental values of the American experiment that will get one there, right? But it's tapping off these shared guardrails. Well, do you agree with the Declaration of Independence? Well, yeah, I do. Well, so we're natural, we're dedicated to protect one another from tyranny and all that. Once you agree on that, you're having a conversation. Okay, does the thing that happened last week, does that further or destroy the pursuit of those natural rights values? I mean, you can have a conversation. You may not agree, but you're actually the guardrails you've created in the conversation are useful ones. I think once you get into that space, the chance of having a productive conversation or possibly changing minds, or maybe you'll learn something from them that's like, oh, I thought about it that way, is there. So it's somehow getting there, but it's not going to work for everybody. The commitment, once you believe that QAnon's real, it's really hard to come back from that.
Okay.
Yes, that's your question.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Colin. That was fabulous.